Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening on our panel on the campaign to free Nazanin. Whilst it's undoubtedly very regretful that we have to be sat here this evening, I do feel very honoured to be joined by three people. Thank you very much for coming in. We're joined by three people who know the case particularly well, I think it's fair to say. So we're joined by Richard, Nazanin Zaghari, Tulip, the Member of Parliament for Hampstead and Kilburn, who is Richard's constituency, and Leanna, who is from REDRESS, who is an NGO pursuing legal claims for human rights, and Leanna leads the work that REDRESS does on this topic. So thank you all for being with us today. I really appreciate it. I think the first thing I'll do is the way I'm going to structure this afternoon is I'll give a brief overview on the case so that everyone is on the same page. And then we'll move to a bit of a panel discussion for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then move to the Q&A so you have time to do it for everyone. So, March 2016, Nazanin and her 22-month-old daughter travelled to Iran on holiday. On return to the UK, Nazanin was arrested by Iranian authorities. Later that year, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison under charges of plotting to topple the Iranian regime by running courses to recruit and train people to spread propaganda against Iran. Nazanin's sentence ended in March 2021. However, she faced new charges and was banned from leaving Iran for a year. As of present, Nazanin is still being held in Iran. So, the first kind of question and topic I want to touch on, I think it's more than safe to say that there is a lot to this tragic and upsetting case. So my first question, Richard, is kind of how do you keep going? How are you? How is the family? And how do you feel about the future?
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Nice to be here. Yeah, I think many people will know a little bit about Nazanin's case. Will have seen us on the television and in the news at different points. And it's been a long-running campaign, probably at different points. Yeah, it's been a journey. So at the beginning, I remember being completely shocked by Nazanin went on holiday. It was New Year, so March, late March is the New Year. 2 week family holiday picture, yeah, like that. I for my sins knew very little about Iranian politics, so kind of knew from the telly that it was sort of a rough place where guys and boys get cross and that stuff. So at that kind of superficial level, it's really actually understand politics. So I kind of thought it would blow over and it would be okay, being asked questions and moved on. And it was only as the days passed on and we didn't know where she was that it began to sort of a delayed reaction of realising, well, not really, gradually realising what was going on. And for me, initially, I was sort of still going to work and kind of almost like compartmentalising it. Oh well, this it's probably the passport travel. She won a later flight and so on, and not quite getting it. And even remember her family in Iran really panicked. And say not panic, they don't panic on them, but when you take them at face value, you don't quite feel the emotion of what's being said, and I didn't have the cultural understanding. It was only for me when she was promised to be released after a week, and she took it. And at that point, we just started something to other groups eventually with REDRESS. But through that process of kind of floundering a bit, going out to talk to people, and I met other families. It was a mixture of people who had been held and could talk about it firsthand, and people who had relatives currently in prison. And that was for me when the wheels fell off, when I realised quite what she was going through, and that's been my city waiting. So what happened for me, in short, was I found it very hard to sit quietly waiting and reach out for us. And so for us, there's a gap between what they say and what they do. So part of it would have been, okay, clearly I presume some sort of panic behind closed doors as to what we do like this. But on the surface, don't worry, just keep calm first. we had a sort of a journey where I remember going to Tulip's office fairly early on, in fact, so talking to sort of two guys in the office who were sort of, young guys, not long out of university at that stage, dealing with things like, all the stuff. It's quite a broad array of things that a constituency office gets to deal with, and gets known. And so this is what's happened. I'm going public in 2 days' time, and no idea what that meant, and no idea what the journey was going to be. And we essentially, went public and started shouting at rooftops. And for a long time, that was almost like my coping, was just going out and talking about it. And kind of on the presumption that if enough people know about it, then the people in charge care enough they'll sort it. And just fairly indiscriminate outrage. And so that ran through. And I remember meeting one of the other families saying, listen, it's probably going to be 3 to 6 months. We haven't done anything. It's crazy. 3 weeks. For ages, 3. I can't do this for 3. Okay. So calming myself, okay, well, I'm going to go, let's make it worst case scenario 9 months, which is until Christmas. And we built a sort of a campaign of just rushing around and shouting. And that went 9 months, and obviously she didn't come out again. And then for me, that was the hard, when you sort of set your worst case scenario, then it doesn't happen. That was when I had my sort of first crash and burn to be picked up. And along the way, we've had a few of them. It's been, other people, those have helped us in Parliament, in the Tube's office, organisations, lots of ordinary people who just care in different ways. And that way in which over time, for me, campaigning is, I remember the minister telling me that rather than campaigning, you should go to therapy, but actually, there is a way in which there is something sort of, you draw the strength from the problem you share is uplifted. And it, I don't think we've been here and we've been as positive without drawing the strength and the care of lots of people. And that probably is true with the through.
In those 9 months, you go well on to that worst case scenario. Gabriella's in Iran.
Yeah, getting bigger.
So you touched on kind of your campaigns, and I think probably the ones that you would be affiliated most about hunger strikes. So I'd be interested to ask kind of what was the inspiration behind your tactics being a hunger strike?
Yeah, I mean it wasn't we did first. So essentially, at the very beginning, we were just trying to get people to care about my story, and probably almost I wanted her to be a story that the Daily Mail would to sort of make her British and sort of British family. So it's quite human. So it wasn't anything like hunger strikes, and actually, I remember with Tulip, so I started a petition. At some point, we got a petition big enough that we took it to Downing Street, which should have been like in month 1, month 2 of the campaign. And I remember we handed it over to David Cameron at stage. The door wasn't open, and Tulip had to go an interview after. It was really feisty. I remember her saying, "Listen, what's the point of the Foreign Office if they can't bring you home? I just used to get rid of them." And I think, whoa, this is because I was still being a little bit more differential in those days. But it was true, and it was actually like, of course, I loved it. It was great to leave it. And the Foreign Office was really indignant afterwards. I can't believe, because one day she might be the minister, and then we'll see what she says. But that kind of there's a process where I think we all go through as families, where you start off disoriented, and you start off thinking it's a mistake. Like, I'm a normal person, this is normal life. This is incredible. And I remember writing I don't know if anyone's seen the petition, Change the World, but writing that very first sort of synopsis of this is our story, and saying, I'll make this sound as terrible as it is. Thinking I was exaggerating, to be honest. Actually, it was a lot worse than I knew. But at the beginning, we all think of ourselves as normal, because we all are. But some stuff can happen around that actually could take a while to appreciate. This is quite where my life has got to. And it probably, it's like a hunger strike, would have felt completely crazy back at that point. But over time, I think it always felt that, it was a surprise in general to talk about that how hard we needed to knock on the government's door to get them to take responsibility, to get them to actually, rather than just sort of slightly patronise us and deflect and which would, for me as a sort of accountant, was an eye-opening experience. I appreciate the government. Like, I kind of thought it'd be a bit like you go knock on the police. They might not solve the issue, but they do accept it's their job to try and solve the issue, rather than dismiss it. And so it was a journey to end up getting us as antagonists. The reason in the end why the hunger strikes happened is hunger strikes are quite a common tactic inside the prisons in Iran. They're quite common tactic anywhere where you have detention centres in this country, lots of people do, because you've actually got very few things you can do. And it's one of the clearest sort of moral messages of protest that there is. It's very clear. And the Iranian system is very used to just sort of waiting it out, because in the end, what are you doing? Most of us have a self-preservation instinct, which is how far do I want it? So Nazanin did a couple, and she did one. And I remember promising myself, well, she does another one. I think the Iranians just go a bit more. The first time there's a shot then. So the second time, that's why I then decided to do one in front of the Iranians. And I probably, which would have been in summer 2019, wildly underestimated how cross the Iranians were just going to get. They were furious that I was making this real eyesore in front of their embassy. And they built a big barricade to block off the view, and then complained that I was breaking the Vienna Convention, barricading the embassies. They'd done it. But actually very useful, because what happened was not so much the British media to some extent, but the Iranian diaspora media, so the various TV stations that serve in the Middle East, loved it because it was really interesting. So they came down and filmed every day. There's some essentially running footage of me feuding with the embassy and the ambassador. Didn't obviously win me any friends amongst the Iranian government, but in terms of articulating a problem that needed to be addressed, very useful. And why did we do the second one, which Nazanin didn't do? That was just me doing it. That was because we in October this year. That's right. And it was for 3 weeks. I have to say, I felt quite a long time. I think felt a lot more middle-aged and the creaky doing it than I had done the first one. And clearly was a lot more irritable. So hung out. So it was a bit more of an ordeal of the whole band. But the reason that triggered it, so we're at a strange point now in our case where as you say, Nazanin served one full sentence, was given another one. In October, they suddenly failed her appeal, which had been hanging around for ages. As this warning shot that you were going to go back to prison, and I couldn't get the Foreign Office to do anything. So it felt, well, the only reason we put nothing back in prison is to create an escalation. And that's the war. By me doing the hunger strike, that prevented the need to put her in prison. Because once you've got someone in prison, it's a lot harder to get them back out again. So that's what triggered it. And then again, I probably underestimated how cross it would make the Conservative Party. Because we did the hunger strike in front of the Iranian embassy. 100 Tory MPs came in. Hunger strike in front of the Foreign Office, maybe 5. And of those, most wouldn't have the photo taken. So clearly there was orders, don't go down there, which was quite a different. So that clearly was because it was focused on the British government. So it wound up, which is quite useful. I mean, part of all campaigning is about articulating the problem and making that problem uncomfortable. It's not about being friends.
So you've touched on the work of the FCO. Boris Johnson stood in and got it wrong, essentially, with the matter, and he has completely misstated why Nazanin was in Iran in March 2016. And Richard, you might want to come in on this as well. How does that make you feel?
Sorry,
You met him that day after.
I did meet him. So I will answer that question, but I'll just rewind slightly and talk a bit about how Richard ended up coming to the office. So, as Richard said, I just had a baby, and I had a baby by emergency C-section, so it wasn't very well. And I got the call from my office, and the reason I'm telling you this is because I just want to give you a view of what MPs do, and constituency MPs especially, because there's no maternity leave in Parliament. And I had a call from my office manager who says, "Did you hear about that lady who was in prison in Iran?" And I said, "Yes, I think I know what you're going to say." And he said, "She's a constituent." I said, "Okay, who's calling us?" Her husband. Send him over. So Richard and I had quite an interesting first meeting with breastfeeding a baby, so I'm holding a baby, Richard and Jeremy Corbyn in my living room, because that's just how it works. And at one point when we're talking about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the baby starts crying and Richard's comforting the baby and so is Jeremy. So it's quite bizarre. But in that, the main thing Richard said to me is that the Foreign Office said to him to stay quiet initially, and he was going against that. So that was my cue. And as a constituency MP, I wouldn't have run this campaign and been a part of it with Richard if I hadn't had my cue from him. So I really took my cue from her husband, because we were going against what the Foreign Office had said to us, but they had said, stay quiet. But when Richard had stayed quiet, nothing had moved. We didn't know where Nazanin was. We got no information. And the minute you go public, the government does sit up and take notice. And if you're in the press, they do sit up and take notice and they do call you. And it sounds so basic to say it, but every time there's an article that's critical of the government, the minister will ring me and say, Tulip, can I just say we're trying everything we can to get Nazanin home? I'm like, okay, you've only said that because there's an article in The Guardian. And that's horrible. It's horrible that we have to get that kind of publicity in order to get a response from them, because what I said outside the Foreign Office is true. What's the point of having the Foreign Office if they won't get a British citizen home? Because Nazanin is British, and so she should be back here. So in terms of Boris Johnson, one of the things that happened is we were trying to get interest from the press for a long time on this case. And initially, people were a bit more reluctant. But when Richard was running his amazing campaign, people were getting more and more interested. Now, everyone knew that Boris Johnson wanted to be Prime Minister, and he was Foreign Secretary at the time. And he was giving evidence to the Select Committee. So, I mean, you know, it's really important to be well prepared if you're going in front of the Select Committee. And the Select Committee was asking questions about Nazanin. Bear in mind, this is the Foreign Secretary of this country. He clearly hadn't read his notes. So when he was asked a question about Nazanin, he said she was in Iran training journalists, which she wasn't. She was on holiday with her daughter, visiting her parents. So the minute he said that, I remember my jaw dropped while I was watching the Select Committee, because I couldn't believe he'd got a vital piece of information wrong. That could mean that my constituent has her jail sentence extended even further. But what happened is that the minute that happened, the whole world got interested in the case. I think they were vaguely interested before, but that was the tipping point, because every media outlet was covering it. I mean, they actually took the cameras away from Prime Minister's questions to look at the panel that Richard and I were leading. That's how important it was, because everyone knew this man was going to be Prime Minister and he'd made a huge blunder. So I was outraged, but one thing it did do is that it meant that Nazanin went on everyone's radar and everyone started talking about it. So in no way will I ever forgive Boris Johnson, but the only redeeming thing of that whole episode, saga, was that at least people started talking about it and more people got interested. And we haven't got Nazanin home yet, but Richard has had lots of wins along the way. So things like she was denied a medical examination. We got that. There were things like she was allowed to come out from furlough for a few days. That was because Richard had relentlessly campaigned. She was allowed to call you twice a week, wasn't it? And that was because Richard had campaigned. She was finally allowed to go to her parents' house and stay there rather than being sent back to prison. She was allowed a phone. I mean, the first day I received a text from Nazanin, I was just like, I can't believe this. She's texting me. So it was just, the communication improved, but it was just the small wins along the way. And in some ways, Boris Johnson made the situation worse. It did mean the world became interested and the world's media became interested as well. And because Liz Truss, who's the current Foreign Secretary, hates being criticised in the press, she absolutely hates it, it's been a real advantage for us in that sense. I don't know if you want to go on to the next question. There's a lot I could say about Boris Johnson, obviously. Don't get me started. But you know, Leanna will comment on this as well, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to ask you, Leanna, was Richard's made it clear in the press that Nazanin is a bargaining chip in the payments from the arms deal dating back to the 70s. Now in the nuclear talks with Iran. And Boris Johnson, sorry to keep bringing him up, I know, but Boris Johnson has said that his quote was, stuff like repayment is difficult to settle and square away for all sorts of reasons to do with sanctions. So what I'm interested in your take of it is it really as complicated and messy as he's making out, or actually is it just a bit more clear cut that the FCDO don't have the will behind them to get it done? What's your view on that?
It's a really good question. I think good to just take a quick step back and look at the context of this. So as Josh was saying, Nazanin was told she was detained because the UK owes £400 million to Iran. That's actually correct. Even the UK government says, yes, we owe this money. As Josh said, the government's saying, oh, we're having difficulty paying it. You know, there's sanctions, it's Iran, it's all very tricky. And yeah, it's been going on for, you know, well, at least 6 years since Nazanin was detained, but decades before that, they've owed this money, court cases, etc. So I think sort of also in this context is that Nazanin's not the only one. And I think, you know, Richard's campaign for Nazanin has helped to put a spotlight on this system whereby Iran systematically detains foreign nationals to effectively hold them hostage in diplomatic negotiations. So there are other Brits, there are Americans, Canadians, Australians, Europeans, people from all over the world who are in a similar position to Nazanin because Iran is using them as bargaining chips. So it's this very orchestrated, very global system that Iran has set up, and it's all political. Everything we hear about the court cases is effectively completely fictitious. Iran doesn't have any rule of law, they make it up as they go along, and these people are just entirely innocent and being detained because of Iran's, you know, hostage-taking system. So it's complicated in that sense. It is complicated in the sense that this is, you know, very, it's all politics. But it's not complicated in the sense that Nazanin's been told what she's detained for, Richard's been told what she's detained for, the Iranian sort of foreign ministry and their public spokespeople basically imply very heavily, this is what we want, almost saying it literally at times. So the UK just needs to repay the money. So we have a separate legal team, or Richard has a separate legal team that sort of specialises in sort of the monetary side and the sanction side of it. But effectively, no, it's not that complicated. They can pay it. There's a whole host of reasons why they can. You know, the fact that the debt predates the imposition of sanctions. You know, the UK has its autonomous sanctions regime. They could apply for a license. Iran has previously said that it accepts it in the form of humanitarian aid, which would be an exception to sanctions. There are so many things they could be doing. So sort of in short, it's not that complicated practically. Well, our position is, and it seems abundantly clear, that the Foreign Office makes it complicated because they are seeing it as a political issue, and they're bringing in the JCPOA negotiations and making it complicated, but ultimately pay the debt, and Nazanin will be released. That's the consistent message.
Okay, so in this whole kind of mix of to pay or not to pay, the MOD have expressed concerns. They don't want to release funds because they're worried what Iran will do with the money in regards to activities in Lebanon, and Syria. Is it really a top priority, a concern? Is it likely? You said it would go to humanitarian aid. Tulip, I'd be interested to hear if you think a Labour Defence Secretary would have a different stance on that. You know, is it really a position for the government to hold money for speculation?
I mean, I think both of them will want to come in on this, but what I would say is that this is a debt that we owe Iran, whether you like it or not. This isn't up for negotiation. They went through an international court trial. We were found to be guilty of not paying the money. It's not like there's a dispute about whether we owe the money or not. It's £400 million, which goes back to the 1970s, right? So we as a country took them to the international courts. They went through a huge court case. In the end, the verdict was, you should pay Iran the money. What have we done? We haven't paid the money. So I guess my answer to your question is, it shouldn't be a discussion about what they're going to do about the money, because first off, we should have paid the money. Who are we to go around the world lecturing other people on international law when we're breaking international law? Because the court basically said you should be paying the money, and we're not listening to that. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is it wasn't just money going to humanitarian aid. They actually said we could pay the humanitarian aid. So then we would know how the money is being spent. So if you're asking me why we haven't paid the money, it's a lack of political will. I don't think it's anything else. And I should just add, Nazanin's been told directly that the reason she's being held prison is because of the money. Rich has been told that. And I was also told that by the Iranian ambassador very recently. So a few months ago, he called me in and he was speaking to me. And I was interested to hear that in the entire conversation I had with him, by the way, he said I couldn't bring Richard, which was quite interesting, but he said I could come on my own. In the entire conversation we had, he didn't once actually say what Nazanin was guilty of. So when I pushed him for why is my constituent in prison, there was never an answer because they don't even have a pretense anymore of saying that she was arrested because of espionage or she was arrested. Those are the things they said initially. She was spying on the states. He didn't even say that. All he said was, we want the money that you guys owe us. So she's in there because of this dispute. She's being held as bargaining chip, a pawn between two countries. And as far as I'm concerned, the government needs to pay it back, and any government in the future needs to pay it back. So, but I'm not the defence sector, I'm not Shadow Defence, I'm Shadow Treasury, but I'm quite important in terms of paying the money back. So maybe if Labour in government, you see a change.
Treasury's not blocking.
Yeah, the Treasury won't be blocking it. But it's not, I just feel like when people say, should we be paying the money back? I really disagree with the premise of that question. I mean, you didn't ask that. I'm just saying, I really disagree with the premise of that question because there's no kind of dispute about the fact that we owe the money. So I really feel like we're breaking international law, and you can't sit and preach to other countries about this if we don't do what's right by us. And I can tell you that there are foreign secretaries who have agreed with me. So Jeremy Hunter actually does agree with this, and he's been he was a supporter when he was there in position, and he's the one who gave Nazanin diplomatic protection against the advice of his civil servants. And he was trying to pay it back, but the problem is they keep getting removed. So every time you've made some inroad with a foreign secretary, another one comes in. We've dealt with, between us, three of us, I've dealt with 5 foreign secretaries and 3 prime ministers in the entire time Nazanin's been in prison. So it's very hard to keep up. Because when a new one comes in, you're telling them the whole story again and trying to get their buy-in, if you like, in the case. So I'm not saying I hope Liz Truss stays, but I'm saying that at least if she stays, she's met with us now and she's heard our story. So she has. She said she was going to bring Nazanin back. She did say that. So let's see.
Yeah.
Richard.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Dying to come in.
well, I think there's a couple. Like, I think there's a point, and it affects government generally, that we have quite a churn in ministers at the moment. The Foreign Office is going to be really change, and there is a way in which, you know, the Foreign Office as an institution will reset things back to where they want to be. The minister has the authority to change things, but it takes a while for them to get their bearings, like all of us in any job, and so you have to build that link and build that relationship and get their understanding. And as Tulip said, until, I mean, paradoxical benefit of Boris Johnson's gap was we then got to meet the Foreign Secretary. Until that point, we've been kept at arm's length, never got anywhere near Philip Hammond, kept fully at arm's length with Boris Johnson. After that, we became a Foreign Secretary level issue, which meant I had the ability to get the Foreign Secretary and get him to feel how unfair it was, and then how I had to feel. And that actually marks our Nazanin's case out from many other cases, is that we get to knock on the right door, person with authority. You meet a junior minister or you meet an official, essentially their job is to be a sponge, to absorb all your complaints and to sort of synthesize down past that chain, and that comes down to attitude and that the state interests of the long run, and they're not curtailed by individuals. And on the debt, I mean, the reality is that yeah, this is it's been sitting there for a long time. That clearly there must be reasons why there's a standoff between the UK and Iran. Iran, for a long time, wanted the weapons, actually. The weapons that wanted the money back. And then it went to court, a long, bitter court fight. Well, all those expensive lawyers got nowhere, so they started taking hostages. And there's a policy choice you've got there as a government as to when our citizens are being taken hostage here, how safe are we keeping people by refusing to pay? You know, it's the safety question, because the government has an absolute obligation to make decisions that keep us safe. That is the first thing the government has to protect the citizens. But you know, having got a very alienated, fairly ruthless regime that you're winding up by not giving them back their money, I mean, does it keep people safe? I'm not sure. the sanctions argument is almost entirely spurious, in that there are sanctions technically, but they're UK sovereign sanctions, so you get rid of them. There is, of course, I mean, and the two arguments that you hear mostly, one is essentially the MOD argument, article, which is to say, the thing is, if we give them money, they're bad guys, they'll do bad stuff with it. Which is, it's the same argument, you wouldn't give money to Al Qaeda or to ISIS. That is the sort of conventional hostage wisdom. You don't negotiate with terrorists because they'll do bad stuff. And the difference between ISIS and the state of Iran is we are doing lots of business with the state of Iran all the time. So what you're saying is, well, this pot of money is toxic, but all those other pots of money, they'll be fine. Well, that's money is all goes to the same pot all goes out. So it is coherent to say, we think you're bad guys and we have nothing to do with you. Or it's coherent to say, we do business with you. You cannot say this pot of money would be dangerous, but all the other pots of money, because we're, the UK, Western BP, and so the state of Iran own oil field. There's lots of vested interests that come from the Shah. The other argument I've got more sympathy for, which is around moral hazard. And the reality will be that all those times that people try to use expensive lawyers to get their money back, didn't work. When they took hostages, that got our money back. So the lesson these guys learned is, well, actually, all that chat, waste of time, let's take a hostage. Oh, it took us a bit longer. But there is one of the things that Leanna and I do quite a lot on is redressing, challenging that business model, I suppose, that actually there will be a part of the Revolutionary Guard, when Nazanin's case is over, will sit back and pat themselves on the back and think, well done, we got our money back. We showed those files. And there does need to be an accountability and a going off them, and the criminal process, and just challenging that actually it's not okay to take us in. One of the battles, diplomacy runs on different. So there's a lot of sort of depicting the world in Ferrero Rocher terms and pretending we're friends, and it falls down every so often. But one of the jobs of lawyers is to come on and call things out as they are, and to pursue things. And we struggled in the early days to get the government. I remember Theresa May in Parliament would answer questions. Would not criticise Iran at all. Would just say we're looking for more information. So would not acknowledge any violation of that. And actually, Boris Johnson in Millwall's Gap was the first minister to ever criticise Iran at all. Jeremy Hunt came in a lot. First one says he was innocent, willing to call out the detentions arbitrary. So, but the battle to get the injustice acknowledged, and I think it's true. So Dominic Raab last year launched the Nazanin's treatment amounts to torture. I think in the last 20 years, that's the only time that a British minister has acknowledged the torture of the British citizens in overseas. I don't think there's any other case. And there are 100 citizens of British citizens a year that are reporting torture to Foreign Office. So that's all going into sort of a black box and just being so the government is set up to not not call a spade. So getting them to recognise hostage taking, recognise torture, recognise it, and then getting them to do something about it, the challenge is kind of where the battle is now. Not sure we've had too much success on getting them to do something, but it's certainly a key to
imagine it.
So, thank you. One of the things I wanted to kind of loop back a bit to was kind of towards the start, Tulip said that Nazanin is British. But one of the problems in this case is her dual nationality, because Iran has said, if I'm correct, that they simply don't recognise dual nationality. So my question for you is, do they have any legal authority at all to come out with something like that? Is there precedent, and how do you respond to that argument?
Yeah, I think it was particularly a problem when Nazanin was in prison, because now she's sort of out of prison but can't leave the country, or waiting to see if she'll go back to prison. There's a particular problem at that time because Iran said she's Iranian, we don't recognise her British nationality, so you can't have consular access. So the British government wasn't able to go and visit her in prison or provide her with any support, etc., etc. Even when she was under house arrest, for the last year of her 5-year sentence, the British government was even too afraid to visit her because they said, oh, we don't have consular access. So effectively, that's Iran's interpretation of international law. It's generally considered to be a wrong interpretation, but it's a very convenient interpretation for Iran. And a lot of the foreign nationals that they detain, the majority of them, I think, are actually dual nationals. They're Iranian Canadians or Iranian Austrians, because it gives them that extra power, because they know that they can, sort of, through their interpretation of the law, can deny any consular access, and that leaves the other countries sort of fumbling around. But I think what we've really battled with is the fact that the UK government has been quite deferential to Iran's position. So Iran says, no, you can't have access because we don't recognize it. And they say, oh, okay, please, are you sure? Can we? And they said, no. And the UK government just says, well, they won't give us access. And so we've been, well, particularly when Nazanin was under sort of custody and house arrest, we were pushing really hard for the government to say, well, no, you say she's British, she is British, so therefore assert your right to access her because she's your citizen. And we find that the government is so frequently sort of kowtowing to Iran's position and kowtowing to Iran's narrative, and hasn't been strong in asserting that this is our narrative. So I think the most stark example was Nazanin's latest court case. We had asked, we'd asked the Foreign Secretary's staff if the ambassador to Iran, the British ambassador to Iran, could attend the court case, could go to the courthouse, could actually just pick her up from the parents' house, drive her to court, and actually be there just to make a statement and just to have a presence. And they didn't do it, and it just felt so weak, especially because at that point, according to sort of Iran's legal system, she wasn't in custody, so they could have done it according to the law. But it's just this, persistent weakness on behalf of the UK government. She's British, claim it and write your own narrative. It's sort of what we've been fighting for.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, my take on it is it's a cynical fig leaf by both sides. So there, under the Vienna Convention, the technical bits, yes, dual nationals have got a slightly different position from mononationals. The Iranians are gaming the consular system by targeting dual nationals so they can seclude them, so we can't have access, and then essentially abuse them in a way that's a bit public and to sort of cause anxiety and pressure on the foreign governments. The British government also uses it as a fig leaf to justify action, to avoid acting as though there's nothing to do about it. And you will see that line saying, when I've had ministers say urgent questions, well, the thing is, so you think there was 2 Australians that were released back in September 2019. Jolie was a settlement, so Australia got their guys out, and she'd have had an urgent question and said, well, listen, hang on, Australia can do it, and why can't we? Well, hello. And the defence, the minister said, well, the thing is, it's much more complex because Nazanin is a dual national, it's much harder. So almost like victim blaming. And of course, the difference is that Australia gave Iran what it wanted, and the UK hadn't. It's a business thing. I think the government, so as Tulip mentioned, Jeremy Hunt invoked diplomatic protection in Nazanin's case. It's a fairly obscure international law. But essentially, it means 2 things. It means, okay, the injustice suffered by my citizen now becomes the injustice on me as a state, and their fight is my fight in that sort of kind of party type standoff. The other thing you require 2 assertions. One is that an injustice has occurred in international law. But the other is that this is my sin, that they're British. So we had to prove that Nazanin was predominantly British. So the position of the UK under international law is that Nazanin was primarily British, had some second passport. And that should be their position going forward. So they should be asserting the Britishness at the point. And clearly there was some internal politics at the time. Minister did it without necessarily it was a good idea. And there was kind of an erasing history pretending it hadn't happened. So actually the government, it's changed just recently, but only after we started writing very aggressive letters. The government's preference for hiding behind dual nationality for inaction, and it's not, the reality is that we can talk more about it. The government's decision to protect anyone in this room overseas is entirely discretionary. It's got nothing to do with whether you're dual nationality. It's the government can choose whether it wants to. But dual nationality is a way of making most of us feel okay. Well, I'll be fine. It's just those ones who don't feel people half foreign. It's kind of, when I was on a panel yesterday about sort of hollowing out the British citizenship. It is a way in which there is a sort of an erosion of what the obligations of the state are. It's a way of rationalising that. But yeah, I've got very little sympathy for it on a legal basis.
Okay. Thank you.
political brand there.
No, not at all, not at all. It's important. Okay, I want to wrap up slightly, just in case there are any questions. So I think what we'll do is if you just have any summary remarks where you think, what you think the next steps are, and then we'll chuck over to Q&A.
Sure. I mean, I'll just pick up on a few things that were said before. One is the sanctions. I'll go back to what I said, which I think is a lack of will on the part of the British government to get Nazanin home. Because the truth is, they hide behind things like dual national, sanctions. But if they bust the sanctions, who's going to come and have a go at them? I mean, that's one of the things I've asked, and they were very annoyed when I asked them that. Is it going to be America? Because Obama sent a plane full of money to Iran to get his citizens back. So who are they to preach to us? So busting sanctions is something they hide behind quite a lot. And I always say to them, what are you worried about if you bust the sanctions to get Nazanin back? They never have an answer to that. The other thing they hide behind quite a lot is Jacob Rees-Mogg said to me when I asked him a question in the chamber, he said, well, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And I'm like, but it's, and we won't pay a ransom because we don't negotiate with the UN state. And that's when I said to him, it's not a ransom. It's the money you legally owe them. So let's not conflate the two. It's not a ransom. That's another thing they hide behind. I suppose the final thing that they hide behind is this whole thing about it's impossible to speak to Iran because it's too difficult to figure out who's in charge, and the Iranian judiciary, and then there's the government, and there's the foreign minister. Who do we speak to? But I'll come back to the fact that the person that Nazanin shared a cell with, like literally the room she was in prison with, is now home in Australia. So how did that government speak to whoever the mysterious person is in Iran? And again, I feel like there's a lack of political will. So, I mean, it's not exactly what you answered, but in terms of next steps, all I'll keep doing is being a thorn in the government's side, keep asking urgent questions. There's been 8 urgent questions in the House on Nazanin. I think it's a record, and not one I'm proud of, but I felt like I had to keep asking. I'll keep raising up Prime Minister's questions whenever I had to. If it's Rishi Sunak after this, he's going to have me on his doorstep straight away asking about Nazanin. But all I can do in terms of next steps is keep using Parliament to raise it. And also, I would just say for you guys as well, it's a campaign that's touched so many people. And it really does help. Like if you are living in an area, if you're living here, you're living in Keir Starmer's constituency, so no point because he's helping already. But if you happen to have family or friends in an area with a Conservative MP, it's actually really useful for you to write to them and say, what are you doing about Nazanin? Because we need that pressure, and I especially need the pressure with Conservative MPs. The Labour MPs are on board anyway, but the fact that the Conservative MPs would go and see Richard on hunger strike and said, please don't take a picture. I mean, come on, which MP doesn't take a picture? It's like photo opportunities, this our whole life, you know? The fact that they said don't take a picture is because the government told them not to. So if you're in a constituency or an area where your parents are maybe, or your family is, or your home address is, to write to a Tory MP and say, have you written to Boris Johnson to ask about what's happening with Nazanin? Are you going to pay the debt? They really don't like questions like that, and they really don't like letters like that. So please do help us on that front. If there is a petition, another petition, which they probably will be, with 6 years of Nazanin's imprisonment coming up, please sign it. Please come to Parliament. The government get very worried when the campaign spreads and more people turn up. They get very nervous, and we're planning something for Nazanin's 6-year imprisonment anniversary, if you like. So please turn up and please support us.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a really good question. Like, well, what next? Because it feels like we've tried quite a lot of stuff.
Sorry, my baby's just going, so I need to. I should have brought her along like this. We would have sat next to each other. But nice to meet you guys, and stay in touch.
I mean, I think for me, transparency, like just part of the. We've had a long battle to get our story out, to get the sort of the choices the government's making. What job of MPs do, what the job of people writing them does, is really just forces the government to explain it. And actually, that's probably the limit of what you can do. It's just getting the government to explain what it's doing and making it clear the choices it's making. And maybe it can justify the choice, which is okay. Nazanin has to suffer because there's a wider good here. But I think where the campaign is going to go, it'll be around getting the government to justify its position on, not just on us, how it protects British citizens generally from torture, how it protects, its hostage policy. It's the things that there are ways in which, I use the phrase Gatsby government. There's a way in which it kind of just, there's a whole sort of show and tell and parade and all gosh, and it all goes wrong with the car crash and good go on. There's a real problem of accountability, a bit large in politics these days, and I think our story is one aspect of that. And the more we as a campaign do to keep the government honest and justified, the safer for us, the safer for all of us.
Yeah, I think sort of from the legal side of things, there's probably three key areas we're working on. One is trying to convince the government to acknowledge that she's being held hostage along with the others. And sort of we, presenting legal opinions to them to show that that is the case under domestic and international law. The second thing is that now that Dominic Raab has acknowledged that she has been a victim of torture, it is to actually make them do something about it and use the Convention Against Torture to actually, hold Iran accountable for the torture it's exposed Nazanin to, subject Nazanin to. And then the third thing is that we've been working with the families of hostages and former hostages around the world to develop evidence of who's actually responsible for this and what have they done. So what are the abuses and who's responsible? And we basically compiled a list of names of people who are responsible for this. This is people who are, responsible for the original detention, those in the court process, those who are working in the prison system, those who engage the propaganda, and those who are sort of the diplomatic marketing of these people as assets. And we're identifying who's responsible as much as we can. And we're presenting these names to UK, US, Canadian, and EU governments and saying you need to sanction these people. Effectively, that means asset freezes and travel bans, like we're doing with all the Russian oligarchs at the moment, which can have a practical impact and also sort of a symbolic impact to say we know who you are and we're holding you accountable for it. So that's sort of what we're working on in the background the whole time.
And I think, really proudly, because we do lots of other families, a situation like ours. So I've got quite a loud voice relative to other families because I'm on the telly a lot, relatively too. There's a way in which there's a strength that comes from that, there's a sense that people care. Nazanin's safer. For lots of the families who are suffering in silence or unsure about what to do, it really eats up. In justice, we all experience injustice at different levels. When you just can't do it, it really eats away. So having something like this where lots of people are able to input, most of them quietly, this was the bad guy, I want this guy. Now it's not as if there's a whole sort of horse trading process to which, because it's not like 1,000 names go forward. There's a whole verification process that the lawyers makers do. But actually knowing that someone is held accountable with anything past us, think of all there's a form of recovery afterwards. That's kind of what redress has always been about. It's that you can mitigate suffering sometimes, you can't stop the suffering because of that. But actually that, knowing that the bad guys didn't get away with it, for that journey back to normal afterwards, really, so really grateful that continues.